It began like many stories of that era, a young man with the courage to fly, born into a world that was reshaping itself after the Second World War. Robert M. Bob Lodge was born on September 18, 1943. He came of age in a country that celebrated its aviators as heroes, where names like Yeager and Doolittle were etched in classroom textbooks and whispered in admiration by wide-eyed boys who dreamed of the sky. Lodge, too, had that dream, but his would end not in textbooks or medals, but in the burning skies over North Vietnam. Bob Lodge wasn't just a good pilot. He was one of the best, intelligent, calm, intensely focused. He was known among his peers for being meticulous, calculating, and deadly precise. The kind of man who didn't just fly for the thrill. He flew because it was a calling, a profession that blended logic with courage, skill with instinct. And Lodge possessed all of it. By the time he joined the U.S. Air Force, the Vietnam War was well underway. The skies over Southeast Asia were no longer the safe dominion of American air superiority. Soviet-made MiG-17s and MiG-21s were giving the U.S. Air Force a fight it hadn't fully anticipated. The North Vietnamese airmen, disciplined and cunning, turned every sortie into a chess match. And in that high-stakes game, Bob Lodge was about to make his move. He was assigned to the 555th Tactical Fighter Squadron, known as the Triple Nickel, based out of Udon Royal Thai Air Force Base. The Triple Nickel was one of the most active squadrons in Operation Rolling Thunder, a bombing campaign meant to weaken North Vietnam's ability to wage war. But the mission wasn't as straightforward as dropping bombs and flying home. The MiGs were always there, waiting, hunting, challenging. It was an arena where only the best could survive. Lodge flew the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, a beast of an aircraft, fast, heavily armed and twin-engined. It was a symbol of American air power, but it wasn't invincible. Dogfighting in the Phantom wasn't like the days of the P-51. It was raw, brutal, and unforgiving. It tested not only skill, but nerves. You had to be faster, smarter, and, above all, unshakably confident. That was Lodge. But here's what made him different. Lodge didn't just want to fly missions. He wanted to be an ace. In the Vietnam War, shooting down 5 enemy aircraft earned you that title. Ace. Few made it. Many died trying. The rules of engagement, the political constraints, and the sheer difficulty of combat in MiG Alley made it nearly impossible. But Bob Lodge wasn't interested in the odds. He was interested in history. His back-seater, Captain Roger Locker, was his trusted partner. Locker knew Lodge's style. Cool-headed under pressure, aggressive when the moment demanded, and deeply respectful of the aircraft and its limits. The two men had flown multiple missions together, and with each engagement, their bond strengthened. They were a team, and in air combat, trust in your back-seater was everything. By early 1972, the U.S. Air Force had intensified its efforts in the region. MiG activity surged. The skies above North Vietnam grew deadlier by the week. Lodge saw it as his moment. He began engaging more MiGs, using careful positioning, team coordination, and sheer pilot skill to rack up confirmed kills. On one mission, he executed a flawless intercept, launching an AIM-7 Sparrow and scoring a clean hit. Another time, he forced a MiG-21 into a vertical climb and picked it off with a heat-seeking sidewinder. It was surgical, lethal, and cold. By April 1972, Lodge had 4 confirmed kills, just one shy of becoming an ace. And then came April 16, 1972. Operation Bolo had been one of the most famous air deception campaigns of the war. But what Lodge would fly into that day was something else entirely. It was a mission designed to lure MiGs into open combat. The target was the Phuc Yen airfield area, deep in enemy territory. Intelligence reports indicated high MiG activity, perfect for a man hunting his 5th kill. Lodge and Locker climbed into their F-4D Phantom II, tail number 667463, and took off knowing the risks. They were entering the most heavily defended airspace in North Vietnam. SAM sites dotted the hills, and radar stations were watching every movement. The mission wasn't just about flying, it was about survival. And Lodge had made a quiet vow before Wheels Up. If he shot down a fifth MiG, he would not eject. He would rather die in the aircraft than risk being captured. He knew what happened to captured pilots: torture, propaganda, years in prison. For Lodge, it was unthinkable. If he were going to die, it would be in the Phantom, in the sky, on his terms. What he didn't know was how fast that decision would come. They were flying combat air patrol at high altitude when the MiGs appeared, fast and aggressive, streaking. In from the west, Lodge's heartbeat didn't spike. He locked in, scanned the sky, and maneuvered. He and Locker spotted two MiG-21s coming in hot. Lodge gave chase, executed a sweeping turn, and launched a sidewinder. The missile tracked beautifully and struck true. The MiG erupted in a ball of fire. It was his fifth kill. He had just become an ace. But in that same moment, another MiG was diving in from above. Before Locker could call it out, they were hit. A missile slammed into their Phantom. The aircraft shook violently. Smoke and flame poured from the rear. They were going down. Locker called for ejection. Lodge didn't answer. Locker ejected. The canopy blew off. He was flung into the sky. Falling. He pulled his chute, spiraling into enemy territory. As he floated down, he watched the Phantom and Lodge continue on a shallow descent, trailing fire until it disappeared into the jungle. Bob Lodge never pulled the ejection handle. The moment Roger Locker hit the ground, he knew he was alone. The dense canopy of the Laotian jungle swallowed him whole. The Phantom had crashed miles away, and there was no sign of life, no chute, no smoke from a secondary explosion, just silence. Locker landed roughly, bruised and disoriented, but alive. Lodge had gone down with the jet, keeping the promise he'd made in silence. A choice that still haunts the men who flew with him. Locker's survival story would become legendary in its own right, but the focus here remains on Lodge, on the choice he made and the legacy he left behind. News of the engagement filtered back slowly. When radio contact was lost and only Locker's emergency beacon was faintly detected, fears spread across the squadron. Lodge hadn't ejected. He hadn't radioed. The initial assumption was grim. He was gone. But for those who had flown beside him, the thought of his loss struck deeper than grief. Lodge wasn't just another pilot. He was their best, the sharpest mind in the sky, the ace they all believed would return home. The military confirmed his fifth kill quickly. His logbook was updated posthumously. He had done it. He had joined the ranks of American fighter aces, a title that only a handful would achieve in the entire Vietnam War. But the celebration was muted, a victory hollowed out by loss. He had made it, yes, but he hadn't come back. Back at Udon, the mood was quiet. His empty bunk was left untouched for days. His name was spoken with reverence, not as a myth or a martyr, but as a friend, someone real. He was known for laughing softly after landing, for triple-checking the fuel flow switches before every flight, for teaching junior pilots the small things that could save a life. Now he was gone, and the war moved on without him. But the truth is, Bob Lodge was never fully gone. What many didn't know at the time was how far his influence had reached. He'd written operational notes, tactical suggestions, mission briefings that were used long after his final flight. His tactics for MiG engagement were quietly adopted by younger pilots. His focus on energy maneuvering, missile timing, radar usage, all of it lived on in manuals, in air combat exercises, in the DNA of the Air Force. And then there was Locker. For 23 days, Roger Locker survived in the jungle. 23 days of hiding, drinking from muddy pools, avoiding North Vietnamese patrols. He made it 60 miles on foot, slowly inching his way toward possible rescue. On the 22nd day, he finally made radio contact. His voice, ragged but clear, sent shockwaves through the command structure. Locker was alive, and with that transmission, Lodge's final flight came back into sharp focus. A massive rescue operation was launched, one of the largest of the war. 40 aircraft were mobilized to extract Locker. It wasn't just about saving a man, it was about honor, a debt to Lodge, a refusal to let his last mission end in silence. They pulled Locker out successfully, and his debriefing was long and painful. He confirmed what many had feared. Lodge had refused to eject. It wasn't recklessness. It wasn't fear. It was resolve. The kind of decision that can't be explained in a briefing room or dissected in a strategy meeting. It was something deeper, something only men who've flown into the teeth of war can begin to understand. Back in the States, the news of Bob Lodge's death didn't make headlines. The war was dragging on, and Americans were growing tired of casualty lists and foreign names. But within the community of pilots, especially those who flew Phantoms, Lodge's story became a quiet legend. They spoke of him not with the loud bravado reserved for mavericks or showboats, but with a kind of hushed admiration. He had fought like a professional, thought like a tactician, and died like a soldier who kept his word. There's something timeless about the image of an F-4 Phantom cutting through hostile skies. Sleek, powerful, unrelenting. And for many, that image will always be tied to Lodge. He was the Phantom. He embodied everything it stood for: speed, firepower, precision, and discipline. He didn't fly to impress or intimidate, he flew to win. And when the cost came due, he paid it without hesitation. Years later, historians and aviation writers would revisit his story. They'd piece together radio transcripts, mission logs, and personal letters. One letter in particular, sent to a fellow pilot just weeks before his final mission, stands out. In it, Lodge wrote, "It's not about glory. Not really. It's about finishing the job with honor. If I ever don't come back, just make sure they know I tried to do it right." And he did. His body was never recovered, and he remains officially listed as KIA, killed in action. But in the minds of those who knew him, that label is too small. It doesn't capture the full weight of what he represented. He wasn't just a casualty of war. He was its measure. A man who set the bar for what courage and duty could look like. In the cockpit, in the decades that followed, memorials were erected, some formal, some not. A plaque here, a squadron patch there. His name is inscribed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C., panel 01W, line 104. Visitors stop and touch the name. Some leave flowers, a few leave flight wings, and somewhere in the stories told over beers in officers' clubs or in quiet hangars at dawn, his story is kept alive, passed from one generation of pilots to the next. He never got to grow old. He never got to see how his story would be remembered. But perhaps that was never the point. Some men are born for peace, others for war. And some, like Bob Lodge, are born for the thin line in between. The cockpit at dawn, the radar pinging, the burst of afterburner, the knowledge that any moment could be the last, and flying anyway. He didn't ask for fame. He didn't leave behind a book or a headline or a parade. Just a record, 5 kills, 1 crash, no ejection, and a legacy that echoes every time a pilot checks his 6 and presses forward into the fight. Long after the war ended, the story of Bob Lodge settled into the realm of memory, but not into silence. In the decades that followed, his legacy would ripple through the ranks of U.S. Air Force aviators, not because of how he died, but because of how he flew. For many young fighter pilots, Lodge became a quiet example of excellence, of discipline under pressure, of courage that didn't need to shout. Within the Air Force community, particularly among phantom drivers, Lodge's story was passed down, like a compass, not meant to be idolized blindly, but studied, learned from, and respected. He represented what it meant to be a pilot of principle in a war that didn't always offer clarity. He was one of the few who held the line between duty and personal sacrifice, and that line became sharper with every retelling. Even for those who didn't know him personally, Lodge's actions stood as a reminder that in the chaos of combat, where seconds could determine life or death, it wasn't just the machine or the missile that mattered, it was the mindset. Lodge had flown with the rare combination of intellect and intuition. He understood radar better than most, could read airspace like a chessboard, and had the nerve to act decisively when it counted. That made him dangerous and respected, and his backseater, Roger Locker, never forgot. Locker would go on to speak publicly about his experience, often emphasizing Lodge's character more than the technical details of the final flight. "He was calm," Locker once said during a squadron reunion. "Even in those last moments there wasn't fear in his voice, just purpose." That purpose extended far beyond April 16th, 1972. Instructors at the Air Force Fighter Weapons School, the Air Force's version of Top Gun, referenced Lodge during training lectures. Not as a myth, but as a real man whose approach to air combat was worth emulating. His situational awareness, his missile tactics, his risk assessment, they became case studies. His final mission was dissected in war colleges, air tactics symposiums, and even classified briefings on pilot behavior under duress. And yet, Lodge's story wasn't without controversy. Some questioned his decision not to eject. In those circles, a debate quietly lingered. Should he have bailed out? Should he have given himself the chance to survive? But those questions often collapsed under the weight of understanding. Lodge had made a conscious choice, one he had discussed beforehand with a select few. He feared capture more than death. Not for himself, but for what it might be used for. The propaganda machine of the North Vietnamese had used captured pilots as tools. Lodge knew that. He also knew that as an ace, a rare and public figure, he'd be high value. And in his mind, that risk was unacceptable. So he flew until the fire reached the cockpit, and then he stayed. It's impossible to know what went through his mind in those final seconds. The firelight dancing across the cracked dials, the smell of fuel, the vibration in the controls. He likely knew the odds. He likely knew there was still a narrow window to punch out. But Lodge wasn't a man who flinched. He'd committed to his path, and he followed it to the ground. In a way, that commitment became its own kind of legacy. Years later, when the F-4 Phantom was finally retired from frontline service, a small ceremony was held at a U.S. airbase in Arizona. Among the speakers was a retired colonel who had flown with Lodge in the Triple Nickel. He stood at the podium, looked out over the crowd, many of them half Lodge's age, and said, "There are names you put on trophies, and then there are names you whisper before takeoff when you need to remember why you're up there. Bob Lodge is one of those names." The Phantom behind him bore the same camouflage paint scheme Lodge had flown. On the fuselage, just below the canopy, someone had carefully stenciled 5 red stars. No name, just the kills. A quiet tribute, the kind Lodge himself would have preferred, but time doesn't stand still. As new generations of aircraft took to the sky, the F-15, the F-16, and later the F-22 and F-35, the stories of the old guard risked fading. It became the responsibility of instructors, squadron historians, and the occasional veteran guest speaker to keep the flame alive. And in doing so, they kept Lodge alive. In 2001, at an air show in Texas, a restored F-4 Phantom II roared over the crowd, trailing white smoke and thunder. The announcer paused as the aircraft banked low and passed the tower. Then, into the microphone, he said, "This pass is dedicated to Captain Bob Lodge, triple nickel, phantom ace, warrior of the sky." The crowd applauded, though many didn't know his story. But for a handful of men standing near the fence line, caps in hand, tears in their eyes, it wasn't about the crowd. It was about memory. It was about loyalty. It was about the sound of the phantom one more time, slicing through the air like it did in the days when Lodge flew it with purpose, with precision, and with the unflinching belief that some things were worth dying for. There's a silence that follows the loss of someone like Bob Lodge, not just the kind you hear, but the kind you feel. It lingers in the hangars, in the empty chair in a briefing room, in the echo of a laugh that no longer comes. It is the kind of silence that doesn't fade with time. It just settles deeper into the bones of those who carry the memory. For the pilots who flew after Lodge, his legacy became something almost sacred. Not worshipped, not mythologized, just remembered the way warriors remember warriors. Quietly, personally, deeply. He wasn't a man of spectacle. No grand interviews, no ego-filled declarations. His friends recalled that he never boasted about his kills or dramatized combat. To him, flying was a discipline, a craft. You learned it, respected it, and never forgot what was at stake each time you pulled the canopy closed and roared off the runway. Bob Lodge had 5 confirmed kills, but in truth, his greatest achievement wasn't the number. It was the standard he set for how a fighter pilot should think and fly. He prepared, he learned, he taught, and when the moment came, he fought with complete control. That's what made him exceptional. And yet, even as his legacy grew, the human part of his story, the boy from America who dreamed of flying, the young man who pushed himself relentlessly, remained elusive. He left no children, no long memoir, no quiet retirement filled with stories. His final act was in a cockpit. His last words were lost in static. His name became a line on a memorial wall, but he was more than a name. Some of his closest friends later said that Bob Lodge had always understood that war was a thief, that it took good men, sometimes the best men, and gave nothing back but memories and sorrow. But he believed in the fight, not in the politics perhaps, but in the duty, in defending your brothers in the air, in doing the job well, in holding the line. In one rare letter home, he wrote, "I don't know what this war will do to us in the end, but I want to know that when it ends, I wasn't just part of it. I did it the right way." That was Bob Lodge. Today, the Vietnam War has become history, a subject taught in schools, debated in documentaries, visited in museums, and yet for some it's still personal. It lives in old flight logs, in faded photographs, in creased letters carried through decades. And in those stories, the name Lodge still carries weight. Somewhere over the jungles of North Vietnam, in a place likely swallowed by time and weather, rests the final pieces of Phantom 66-7463. No recovery team ever found it. No ceremony was held at the crash site, but that absence, that unresolved ending, only added to the reverence. For many it felt fitting. Lodge belonged to the sky, and maybe, just maybe, the sky kept him. In aviation circles, there's a phrase often passed among fighter pilots: he slipped the surly bonds of earth. It's borrowed from a poem, but it captures the feeling of flight, of freedom, of leaving the noise and clutter of life behind to touch something eternal. Bob Lodge did more than slip those bonds. He raced beyond them, broke through the edge of fear, and gave himself fully to the thing he loved. To this day, there are still pilots, young and old, who say his name before missions. Some carry patches stitched with triple nickel on their gear. Others touch the wall in Washington and stand in silence. Some don't say anything at all. They just fly the way Lodge would have wanted. Sharp, ready, and with heart. In 2022, 50 years after his final flight, a small group of veterans gathered at Udorn, now quiet, overgrown, and no longer a frontline base. They stood where the old runway once stretched out under the Thai sun. They raised a toast, looked into the wind, and said nothing for a long moment. Then one man, now grey and bent with age, finally spoke. He didn't die chasing glory. He died doing the thing we were all trained to do and finish the mission. And he finished it. We never forgot, and they never will. Bob Lodge is not buried in Arlington. He has no grave, no headstone. But his name, his true memorial, lives in the sky, in the roar of jet engines, in the trembling hands of young pilots before their first sortie, in the fire of missile trails and the cold calm of radar lock. He lives in the code, in the greed, in the soul of every man and woman who steps into the cockpit with purpose, because in the end, some stories don't fade, they fly.